So the title of the presentation is Working with Loose Theories of Change. I put the word loose in inverted commas because it's not an adjective typically used to describe theories of change. If it is, it's usually in a pejorative sense, but I'm using it in a more realistic sense. So what I'm going to be looking at is alternative approaches to exploring and testing complex causal models of development interventions. And I need to work out how to push this thing forward, so I'm going to try this. Okay, so the proposals, the ideas I'm going to be putting forward have been informed by reading and experience in a number of areas, and I've tried to list these up here. One which some people might be aware of is ITAD's current macro evaluation of empowerment and accountability projects, which is underway, and I have a small technical input via the CCAS arrangement into that evaluation. Secondly is some analysis of data on the Civil Society Challenge Fund projects. That fund has been managed by Triple Line and Crown agents and is just drawing to a close now, and I've done some work on that in the last few months. Thirdly is a shorter involvement with Comic Relief, doing some participatory portfolio analysis exercises. And then there's two bodies of literature one is on QCA, that's qualitative comparative analysis, and particularly the work that Barbara Bafani's doing. Some of you may be familiar with her and her work. And the other is a body of literature on predictive analytics, which perhaps less people will be familiar with, which is a form of data mining. And finally, my current experiences with developing an Excel application to operationalize some of the tools that are mentioned in here. This is a piece of work underway at the moment with a software company called Activate. And I'll just hold up two books which are I found very useful. A Tale of Two Cultures, which is comparing qualitative and quantitative methods of social research without dissing either side of those two perspectives. Been the most interesting book I've read for ages, and a lot of what I'm saying is very consistent and informed by what's in this book. The second book, I hope the camera's up here, is called Predictive Analytics and Data Mining, and this is a very useful guide to predictive analytics using a software suite called RapidMiner. So we'll move on. So what I'm going to be talking about today, there are three common features of the approaches that I'm going to be outlining. One is the data, and this is data on what has already happened. This is the foundation of the discussion that I'm taking forward. Secondly is a view of causation, one which has a reasonable fit with the complexity of the world that we see and have to deal with. And thirdly, a set of methods which can analyse this data in the light of this view of causation, that are consistent with this view of causation. I'm going to be talking about three of these, probably spending most of the time on the third one. Why bother with this exploration of alternatives? So I thought there were, in a sense, two objectives that I have been pursuing by default. One is, it would be great if we had more than one method to explore complex causal models of what's going on, because that way we could triangulate the results that are produced by one method against another and just see how robust they were. And the second is that with all methods have strengths and weaknesses. So if we have an array of methods, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, as a set, they might provide a wider range of applicability than we have with any one method. So I'm just going to move on now to the type of data that is the foundation of the analyses that I'm going to be describing. It's fairly simply structured. Basically, you can imagine an Excel file where you've got rows and they're describing cases generically, for example, projects. And the columns will describe the attributes of those projects, maybe attributes of their context, and importantly, the outcomes of those projects in one form or another. And the cell values in this Excel file could contain any of these three types of information: the presence or absence of these attributes, or some sort of scale rating the extent of achievement of an outcome, or some numeric values like costs. And here's an example. Now, I know you can't read the details. I'm just going to give you a bit of background on this. The top part is a composite set of data from the Civil Society Challenge Fund, representing 35 projects with data taken from project proposals and project completion reports spanning a 5-year period of time. There's something like about 70 columns there altogether. And then the data set you can see underneath that is a subset, and you can see the two arrows pointing to where it came from. There are about 10 attributes of the different types of capacity building that these projects were involved in. And on the right-hand side, one of the outcomes of interest, which was whether the project was rated as being effective or not. Let me catch up with my notes. In this example, in the data set that you can see in most detail, the cell values are basically binary, just saying whether that project was using that capacity building, whether that type of capacity building approach was being taken or not. But elsewhere in the data set, there'll be some more numerical data, and there's a lot of rating data. So that's the sort of data set that that a lot of the analysis tools I'm going to be talking about might be looking at, a mixture of data types. Those red stripes at the bottom are just saying the data is missing here, so there may be cases with no data on some attributes. And it's not a huge number of cases. There's 35 cases. We got another 25 a month or two later, so there was a total of 60 cases. We're not talking huge numbers of cases. So I'm now going to move on to the view of causality. And some people might recognize this view of causality, called multiple conjunctural causation, as one that's associated with QCA. It's quite important to point out that it's not specific to QCA, and other methods and approaches can be consistent with this view of causation. The next two slides I'm just going to describe the key attributes of this view, and then later on I'll give you some practical examples. So in multiple conjunctural causation, could someone turn their mic off who's tuned in? In this view of multiple conjunctural causation, what the core idea is that most events that we see are not caused by a single causal factor, but by a combination of these. So that's what conjunctural means. It means a combination of causes acting together leads to something happening. And the second point is that often events arise from multiple different combinations of causes. I might go to a conference because I had a particular set of reasons for doing so and opportunities, but somebody else might go to that conference because they were told to go there, and somebody else might go there for different reasons altogether. So there'll be multiple conjunctural causation. There's another way to describe this is called equifinality. In other words, there are many routes to the same end. And the last point to make is asymmetrical causes, that I might not go to a conference, not simply because I don't have the motivation and the money to pay, which would lead me to go, but because something else blocked my way to going there. For example, someone in my family was sick, and despite having the money and the interest, I didn't want to go there. So causes can be asymmetric. The causes of things happening are not just the absence of causes of things happening. And when we look at individual causal conditions, typically when we think about correlations, A is correlated with B, we might come up with the simple idea that, A is causing B, and maybe we've got evidence of a really strong influence or weak influence. But within this view of multiple conjunctural causation, we get a more nuanced view. There are lots of different types of causal conditions, and the four which I'm just going to describe briefly here, I'll give some examples of later on. So if we look at a causal condition or causal factor, I'm using the word condition because that's what QCA, how they describe it. A causal condition may be necessary but insufficient. A causal condition may be sufficient but unnecessary. A causal condition may be necessary and sufficient. And it may be neither of those, but still important, because it may be part of a package of other conditions. And some of these go by these rather obscure acronyms down the bottom called INUS and SUIN, and I'll give you an example of what these are. I won't dare to explain them without an example because you'll feel befuddled, quite justifiably so. So I'm now going to move on to looking at how you go about analysing those data sets, the kind of data sets that I've showed, in a way that's consistent with that view of causality, which might lead us to some conclusions about what is happening with projects in those data sets. And the method I'm describing, again, it's consistent with the way how QCA works, but it's also consistent with other approaches. So it's basically two types of exercise. The first is what you would call a cross-case analysis, where you're looking across all those cases in that Excel data set and looking for patterns of attributes associated with outcomes. This is the core of the process and where I'll be spending most of my time. Secondly, there's a process of within-case analysis and use of knowledge, and this happens at two stages, at the beginning and at the end. At the beginning, we need to define the boundaries of the cross-case analysis. We can't analyse every bit of data in the world. That Excel spreadsheet that you saw, there was other sets of data left out of that spreadsheet because it was decided it just wasn't worthwhile including. Defining the boundaries of the cross-case analysis is done and can be done by a number of methods, but one of these is using loose theories of what is happening. The second type of use of within-case analysis is at the end of the process, where once you've found a pattern, you want to try and understand what's going on there. And in this case, you're looking inside those cases for the causal mechanisms that might be underneath those associations, which might make them work as causal configuration. So I'm going to now go into this in more detail. And in the first case, I'm going to look firstly at this process of defining the boundaries. It's often the case that you will have a data set of projects, maybe 35 projects, but you might have there may be many different attributes of those projects which are potentially important. You may have a whole lot of data on them, maybe you don't. But this problem of having too many attributes relative to the number of cases, in two different spheres of work, in data mining and QCA, they have their own name for it. In data mining, it's called the curse of dimensionality, which is lovely and dramatic. In QCA, it's called the problem of limited diversity. And if I can try and explain very briefly what that's all about, every time you add a new attribute or a new column to a data set, you're in effect doubling the number of possible combinations of all those attributes which might within them hold a combination that really is the pattern, which is the causal configuration that matters. So because you've doubled the number of possibilities, if you want to test whether those possibilities are really happening or not, you need to double the number of cases. So doubling the number of cases is not something that normally is very easy. So you've got to be very careful about how many attributes you include in your data set. Now, there are two types of solutions that people have approached with this. And the first comes from the data mining sphere, and these are called feature selection algorithms. Another word for project attributes would be a feature. And so there are various algorithms can be used to look through all the potential columns in a data set and throw out some which won't be of any use, and thus reduce this problem of excess number of possible combinations to test. And you can imagine the simplest one exercise here might be if you found a high correlation between the presence of one attribute and the presence of another, there'd be no point including both of them in the data set. There's also some interesting stuff that you can do with Excel, which I might talk about later on. Now, the other approach, which tends to be used more by QCA, is to actually have a more theory-led approach, and that is to partition all those possible attributes into groups and say, well, look, we want to look at this group first because they're all about this aspect of what's going on, and we have this prior view that this aspect is really important, and so we're going to look at that first and then later. So in QCA, there's two versions here of this sort of theory-led approach. One is a two-step where you might take a look at a macro influencing factors in the big international context, and then you might look at local factors. Or you might look at different levels in a nested theory of change. So here is a matrix where in the case of triple line, when we're looking at this huge wodge of data, this very large data set, down the left-hand side are 7 groupings of 52 attributes of the project. So we tried to group all those attributes of the projects into 7 subsets. Some of them are about the nature of the partnership, some of them are about the nature of capacity building, a nature of project management, what civil society challenge fund objectives they are addressing. And across the top, we have about 10 different objectives, of which some projects were trying to achieve and others weren't. And each of those cells represents a sort of a loose theory. For example, the cell that relates capacity building to effectiveness, there, triple line had an expectation, a sort of loose theory, that the way in which NGOs carry out capacity building will affect how effective their projects are. But they didn't have a really detailed theory of exactly how that would work. So each one of those cells is a little sort of mini loose theory, and what we did in this exercise, there was a consultation process at the beginning where we asked the triple line staff to identify which of these mini theories were of priority interest to them, which would be most relevant to them. We could do some analysis for every cell in this matrix, but as you can understand, that would be much more time consuming. So this is a process of prioritizing, and the initials there refer to whose preference it was to look at that particular mini theory. Let me just catch up on my notes. Another way of viewing this matrix here is as a gigantic haystack of enormous proportions. And what we're doing through this consultative process is deciding what parts of the haystack we're going to explore in the hoping of finding useful needles. So even when we've focused in on one particular cell in that matrix, where there's one particular loose theory, for example, about how capacity building might have an effect on the effectiveness of projects, we're still faced with a huge number of possibilities that we have to sift through and look at by one means or another. So, for example, a simple data set with 15 project attributes has 2 to the power of 15 possible combinations, one of which might be the most accurate predictor of what type of capacity building leads to most effective projects. So, in this case, that adds up to more than 32,000 possibilities. So we've still got some serious thinking to do about how to work our way through all those possibilities. We have to work out how to search this huge space of possibilities and how to evaluate the results of such a search, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to outline 6 types of search strategies that can be used. These are not mutually exclusive. The first one, which people will be most familiar with, is the idea of theory-led hypothesis testing. That, okay, in that mini theory about different types of capacity building, staff may have a view that certain forms of capacity building are absolutely essential. In other words, they're necessary, but maybe not sufficient to achieve the objective. So in that case, prior research and experience might direct people to testing a specific combination of attributes which they think is going to lead to the outcome. This combination, the more specific it is in its description, the easier it will be to test it. But the more specific it is, the smaller the area of the haystack we're looking in, and the big risk there is we're losing sight of where else those valuable needles might be. So it's quite likely with a hypothesis-led testing approach, we may miss unexpected solutions. Okay, theory and past experience might guide us in useful directions, but we also have a risk of losing sight of other possibilities. The next possibility is almost the diametric opposite, and that's exhaustive search, which you can do with computers these days. You can literally get a computer to search through and test every possibility to see how good it is at predicting the outcome. This is feasible, but time-consuming. It's feasible to do with small data sets and where the data is in binomial form rather than numerical data. It can be speeded up with computer program software like R and with an Excel application, which I mentioned and we'll talk more about. So the next 2 strategies fall all within the broad category of algorithmic searches. An algorithm is a systematic step-by-step procedure that takes you to achieving a certain end, often involves a lot of iteration, and will come to an end when it's achieved a certain target or performance measure. So the first one of these, the first algorithm, is called Quine-McCluskey, and that's at the core of QCA. I won't go into the details of how it works, but I can later in the discussion if people want to know about that. QCA has its origins in political science, but it's now has been used for evaluation purposes in quite a number of interesting cases, and I think it's going to be getting wider use. It's a technically demanding method to master, and more importantly, it can be difficult to communicate the results in a way that I'll show you shortly. There's specialist software available, a number of different software packages. On the other, this is where Barbara Bafani has been doing a lot of work on the use of QCA. Decision tree algorithms are a different algorithm altogether. They have their origins in data mining, used widely in business and in science, but not yet in evaluations. I think the positive side of this algorithm is the results are much easier to comprehend when they're visually displayed. Again, there's software available, and this is open source. This is an area which I've had more experience in than QCA. This is an attempt to display the result, two types of QCA results. It comes from an analysis of water aid, use of technology to improve the reporting on faults in water supply systems. And that string of algebraic type formula at the top is typically how QCA results would have been reported very early days in more academic circles. And I will try and read the first one to tell you what it means. It basically means that with conditions where conditions A, B, C, D and E are present, or where conditions A and B are present but not C, but yes, D and E are present, or etc. So, you know, that's one way of presenting it. But fortunately, more recently, people have been experimenting with other ways of visualizing the data. And what you're looking at below in the matrix there are 5 conditions across the top, and each row represents a different configuration which seems to be associated with a type of outcome. The green reflects the presence of an outcome. People are using technology to report water supply functionality, and the 2 beige columns rows are where they're not using that technology. So the tick and the cross indicates that in that configuration, that condition is part of that configuration. In other words, some of the positive outcomes are explained by the presence of all 5 of those conditions. Some of them are explained by the presence of 4 but the absence of 1, and some of them are explained by the presence of 1 and the absence of all the others. So that's one way of presenting the results. It's an achievement in that it uses only 5 out of the 9 attributes, so it's managed to simplify our view of the world. And I tried to remember the number of cases. I think the number of cases was something like about 10 or 15. So you've gone from 10 or 15 individual cases down to 5 configurations. So it's provided us with a simpler view of the world, but it can be simplified in a way that I'll talk about a bit more. We're aiming at simple models that have some accurate reflection of what's going on, prediction capacity. So this is a different type of result. This is a result of a decision tree algorithm, and I'll explain how this works. The attributes this is going back to the Civil Society Challenge Fund, and we're looking here at attributes which may be present or absent. Each one of those nodes is an attribute of a project which may be present or absent, and the lines connecting them underneath are saying whether the attribute above is present or absent. 1 means present, 0 means absent. So if we look, if I read this for you, if we look at capacity building of local government, where that's absent, the model predicted that most projects would not be very effective, and the data showed that 7 out of 8 of them were not effective. On the other hand, if we look where capacity building of local government was taken place, and where capacity building of private sector organisations was not taking place, but where capacity building of end beneficiaries was taking place, then the model predicted that in most of the projects would be effective, and that is the case. 13 out of the 14 cases were effective, projects were effective. Not only that, in this diagram we can see that capacity building of local government, the absence of that is sufficient and is sufficient for projects not to be effective. In other words, if you don't have that, then you're on the road to not having an effective project in this data set. On the other hand, we can see that capacity building of local governments is sufficient, but is necessary but not sufficient. In other words, as part of each one of these branches is a configuration, and capacity building of local government, where that's present, that's a necessary part, but it's not sufficient. It's got to have those other conditions present before those other outcomes will take place. So we've got 5 different causal configurations, 2 to do with the positive outcome, 3 to do with the absence of the outcome, and some of those conditions are necessary but not sufficient, others are sufficient, and others are of more complicated status. So we're able to capture that complex form of causality in a diagrammatic form that's produced as a result, that's generated by an algorithm. I'm now going on to another algorithm called genetic algorithms. These are algorithms that try and mimic the evolutionary process by breeding lots of possible solutions, testing them and then retaining the more successful solutions, interbreeding them and throwing in a bit of random mutation, and then testing them again and breeding them again, etc., just like an evolutionary process. This algorithm is widely used in business and engineering for optimization problems, but I have never seen it used for evaluation purposes, but I think it's got a useful role to play. Surprisingly, one version of this is available as a free add-in to Excel, and it's called Solver. And I have managed to use it to triangulate both the results from QCA and decision tree algorithms. You can use it to see whether it comes up with the same result or even a better result. In the case where I applied it with that water aid data, it was able to find 3 rather than 5 configurations using 2 rather than 5 conditions. So it came up with a more parsimonious solution. Okay, we'll just move on now. This is just a quick view of the interface for Solver, and I just want to highlight some key aspects of this. In a genetic algorithm, you always got to tell it what it has to optimize, and that in this case is the accuracy of its prediction, the configuration. You want to find a causal configuration that really has a high degree of accuracy, so you tell it which performance measure to use, and we'll come to that shortly. Then you've got to tell it what things it can vary in order to achieve that performance, and that's basically that mix of conditions. What mix of conditions should be present or absent, so it gets told which ones it can play with. And then there are constraints telling it, for example, that you can't have negative values, or you can't have values that go up to 1,000. It's just some real-world constraints on what the sort of things it can do. And this solver, in my experience, will generate a solution usually within about a minute, with the sort of small data sets that I've been working on. Now I want to come on to something quite different, but there's still methods which are entirely consistent with the sort of causal perspective that we've been talking about. And these are what I call ethnographic/participatory methods. And the first person to develop something in this area was a person called Christina Gladwin, an anthropologist, who developed a process of modelling called ethnographic decision tree modelling. And as the name suggests, it's got quite a lot of overlap with that idea of decision tree, the decision tree algorithm. The process of developing these models is time-consuming, which is sort of understandable if you're coming from an anthropological background and you want to deeply understand the worldview of the people that you're working with. The positive side from a sort of evaluation practice perspective is that the performance of these models is actually measurable and independently verifiable, and there are examples of where that has been done which I could provide you with. There is an alternative to this sort of ethnographic and participatory approach using a card sorting technique. Card sorting is one way of trying to elicit people's categories in use, or pile sorting is another way to another name that's given to it. And there are many different forms of card sorting, but one which I developed in the course of my thesis field work quite a long time ago is called hierarchical card sorting. And with this, you can develop a tree structure which represents their conception of, say, key differences between projects, people's view of the key difference between projects, and also their predictions of what types of projects will perform better than other. Again, with these structures, you can both measure the performance of these models and independently verify them. The key thing about these approaches is that they can be used to tap into the existing and often informal and semi-tacit knowledge of people who are managing that set of entities. It might be a someone in a grant-making agency that is managing a whole portfolio of grants. They will have their own tacit and informal and explicit theories of what's going on, and these methods are one way of uncovering those views and making them more testable and accountable. Here's a photograph of an ethnographic decision tree which I found just recently. You can just make out the tree structure there. It's about whether farmers decide whether or not to harvest thatching materials to thatch their dwellings, and the outcomes which are predicted are, will I go ahead and harvest the material or not harvest the material? And you can see there are a number of conditions that have to be met before certain decisions are made, and there's different routes whereby they could come to those decisions. This is the result of a hierarchical card sort. I'm sorry for the faint detail there, but the important thing to bear in mind is just the structure. You'll see the structure is a tree structure, this time on its left-hand side, And this was done with comic relief. I sat down with the manager of a portfolio of projects and asked them to identify the most significant difference between all these projects in terms of how they were trying to achieve their objectives. And the biggest difference between them in the two cards just almost to the left was how wide their focus was on what they were trying to change, whether it was a very local process of change they were trying to engineer or a more national level change. And then amongst the ones with the wider focus, I asked them to split those projects into two groups according to the type of the most significant difference between these projects, and they identified whether they were locally driven projects or donor-driven projects, as in driven by the UK NGO that they were partnered with. And so you can imagine this subdivision process keeps going on until you've got a very detailed nested category and you've got a tree structure, and then you walk the people down this tree structure, asking them at each point, now which of these two types of projects do you think will be more successful than the other? So the red line is where they've said this type of project will be more successful than the black line. And then you reiterate that process, and at the end you come up with a ranking of projects according to expected achievement relative to each other, and this can then be compared to independent data, say evaluation data on those projects. Okay, so we've gone over the different ways of finding our way through the haystack, all these different algorithmic and non-algorithmic methods of finding where in the haystack we might be able to find some useful predictors, some useful configurations that are good predictors of the outcome. And there's one method you can use to assess the performance of these models, which is applicable across all of them. And this is something called a confusion matrix, not a very encouraging name, but it's also basically just a simple truth table. And in this truth table, you count the number of cases that fit into each cell. So, for example, on the left-hand side, our predictive model says that the outcome is present, but then the data, and the data says it is present, so they're what you call true positives. We count the number of cases there. We also count the number of cases where the model says the outcome is going to be present, but the data actually disagrees with us and says no, they're not, so they're false positives. We count the number of cases where the model says the outcome will be absent, but the data disagrees with us and says the outcome is present, so they're false negatives. And so on, we have in the final category true negatives. So this basic set of data is amazingly useful because there's a whole range of performance measures which use this information to tell us how well the performance of the predictive model has gone. And I'll mention some of these very briefly. These are ones that I probably would often give attention to, but they're not the only ones around. We would want to look at the support, which is the percentage of cases that a prediction rule apply to. Some prediction rules, some configurations, may only apply to a small percentage of cases, but we still might be interested in them. On the other hand, some predictive rules might have a really wide applicability. They seem to, they seem to filter out a large proportion of all the positive outcomes. They apply to a large proportion of those. And then, most importantly, we want to see actually how accurate was that. So this is where we would look at the percentage of all the cases that are true positives and true negatives. We want to have fewer false negatives and false positives. So accuracy is one common global measure of a performance problem. And then we also want to know whether the model did much better than chance. And so the last measure here that I mentioned is lift, which is the incidence of true positives compared to the prevalence of the outcome overall. You know, if 20% of all our model's predictions were correct, and in fact the outcome was present 20% of all the cases, our immediate reaction probably would be that model's not particularly useful. It hasn't done much better than just random choice would. So there are a whole array of measures, and the important point to note here is that there is no one single measure that is the right measure. It's not like a 5% significance level in statistical testing of correlations. There is no one measure that's always the appropriate measure. There is one other measure which I think is underplayed, and that is the simplicity of the model. And the simplicity, which I touched upon earlier, is the number of prediction rules that are needed to account for all outcomes. And in that QCA, the water AD example, you saw there were 5 different configurations which are part of the model, and the number of attributes, and I think there were 5 attributes in those as well. So that was relatively simple compared to the total number of cases and the total number of attributes in the data set. So why should we worry about simplicity? Well, from a practical point of view, any model that is simple, involves simple rules, is probably going to be easier to implement than one that involves complex combination of attributes. And secondly, simpler rules tend to have a wider applicability. They tend to be potentially operational in a wider range of circumstances. I now want to say some cautionary words about algorithms. There's been discussion in the past about artificial intelligence and whether it will take over humankind or not. And the counter-argument is that most artificial intelligence and most computer-based ways of processing data are really not about replacing human beings but augmenting human judgment. And that is what I would argue in this circumstance here. We're looking at algorithms that can augment our process of judgment. It's important to point out that algorithms don't always produce a unique best answer. And this is for 2 reasons. One is that each algorithm has its particular limitations. There are particular weaknesses in most algorithms. Secondly, the data itself. We may have data which has many more attributes than cases. And in those circumstances, no matter what method you use, you may well turn up finding that you may find out that more than one attribute can be a good predictor of an outcome, or more than one configuration of attributes can be a good predictor of outcome. The implication of all this is whenever you find a result from using algorithms, it's really important, in my personal experience, to manually tweak the predictive models. And this has 3 advantages. One is that sometimes when you tweak a model that's been found by an algorithm, you will find simpler but equally good performing models. Secondly, next door to that existing model, there is a slight variation that may not do quite as well or may do just as well, but it's just next door by removing one condition or changing one condition. That practically is potentially quite useful. It just means that you don't have to be absolutely doctrinaire in implementing this model. It doesn't have to be reproduced with complete fidelity. And the other interesting thing is when you tweak the predictive models and take out one attribute and put it back, you can identify the extent to which it is contributing to the overall performance of the model. Sometimes when you take out an attribute, it makes almost no difference to the performance of the model at all. Sometimes it makes a dramatic difference. And so there we're doing something like contribution analysis. We're identifying the relative importance of the different attributes in the model. This tweaking is something that is possible with this Excel application that I'm working on. How are we going for time-wise? I think
we've got half an hour left, including questions.
Okay,
so.
I will skip the next bit. This presentation will be available. The next bit is about investigating results of cross-case analysis. I'm going to skip that bit and go on to the summary, which is where we sort of produce, hopefully, some useful broad conclusions. So in summary, when to use what? Ethnographic participatory methods, when you want to understand and explore and test the theories of specific stakeholders, and when there's no data set readily at hand, because you're literally generating the data through the exercise. QCA, when there's a reasonably well-developed theory of change. I think Barbara Bafani would be fairly strong on that point, and when the data set has sufficient diversity. Decision tree algorithms, when you want easily communicable results. Genetic algorithms, when you want a quick exploration of alternative solutions. Exhaustive search, when you really need certainty that the solution that you're looking at is the best one available. And this is getting into promotional territory, but this Excel application, when you want to tweak the results of all the above and just see whether you can improve on them and just how vulnerable they are to missing one bit or another. When to use any of these, when numerical data is hard to find. A lot of the data attributes in that Excel file were nominal data, just the presence or absence of different attributes of projects. So it's nominal rather than numerical data. Where experimental approaches are impractical, experimental approaches have to be set up in advance, and the project has to be carefully managed to not conflict with the experimental methodology. However, data analysis of the kind that we're describing here can happen after the event, so long as you have the data, unless you're doing the ethnographic approach where you're not reliant on having a prior data set, you're relying on finding someone who knows or thinks they know about those entities. And thirdly, where causal complexity is likely to be high, and we're talking here about large projects, decentralized projects, which have diverse interventions and context. And two examples of these are grant-making programs and participatory development programs. What to look out for, to be careful for when someone's proposing an approach like this. How good is the underlying data? Are all the relevant attributes included? For example, in the Civil Society Challenge Fund, there was surprisingly little data on the kinds of partnership arrangements that were present in these projects, and everybody recognised that actually that could be a really important predictor of the success of a project. Is there a sufficient range of attribute values? Are all the projects rated as being very effective? If so, you're never going to be able to develop a good predictive model. Is there a diversity of cases? In other words, there's no cases just with exactly the same configuration. And you've got enough cases that represent a significant proportion of all the possible configurations. Did the stakeholders' views inform the selection of attributes and outcomes for the analysis in that early sort of narrowing down exercise? Who decided where you would narrow down, what area of the haystack to look at? Coming on a bit further, transparency of process, important in all evaluations, and here as well. You want to know who participated and how, in the case of the ethnographic and participatory approaches. What performance measures have been used, because there are more than one. What search parameters were set, because there's always particular parameters that can affect the use of algorithms. How have the results been triangulated by one of these other methods? And was the approach to within-case analysis systematic and transparent? We've skipped that section. And finally, some lessons of my own, some of which I've touched upon already. Successful models are not distinct entities standing out on their own. Next door to them are a lot of adjacent possibilities that sometimes work almost as well. And that's quite heartening information, I think. Secondly, it's not only success, it's not only those that should read true positives, it's not only true positives that matter, investigating the false positives where things were expected to happen but did happen, and the false negatives where we didn't expect them to happen but they did. Investigating those is a major route towards improving existing models and learning about what's going on. And unambiguous success is rare. It's rare to find a model where there are no false positives and no false negatives. So really what we're looking for in most cases is models, configurations of project attributes which have an acceptable level of accuracy and an acceptable level of support. You know, a stock market investor can make a killing if they have a model that just works 55% of the time. You know, okay, surgeons want one that's 99% of the time, but for stock market investors, you know, level of accuracy of 55% will do you very well. So we just need, in the context we're working in, to find appropriate levels of accuracy and support. And I think I will end there. There's some other slides which I can provide. You will see in the slide, in the slide set when you see later on. But one of my favourite quotes is this one here: 99% of problems have already been solved in some other field. And I think really all I've done today is just bring in some of those other ideas to share them with you. Right.
Great, fantastic presentation. Thank you very much.